Hi, this is Yvonne Asmah, and welcome to Did You Know? Today is August the 8th, 2018, and this is episode 7. Today I'm going to talk about how Indigenous children are overrepresented in the child welfare system and how you can be an ally. So let's get right into it and get into the legal and policies behind the Indigenous. The Government of Canada in Section 35 of the Constitution Act defines three groups of Indigenous people. First Nations, otherwise known as Indian, Métis, and Inuit. Now, the policy that governs the Indigenous population is called the Indian Act. The Indian Act was incorporated in 1876. It is a federal law that governs the Indigenous population through status and treaties. It allowed the federal government to regulate the activities of the Indigenous living on reserves and control the education of their children. Usher, whose authority on Aboriginal land claims, states it is worth noting that treaty boundaries had little to do with traditionally occupied territories of the Indian signatories, but had a lot to do with the needs of settlement and political control. The Indian understanding of treaty was somewhat different. While they did not want to interfere with government officials, they also considered that they secured the necessary guarantees of their traditional livelihood and continued to benefit from and manage their own resources and activities. Now, the legal institution that governs the Indigenous people of Canada has changed throughout the years through the direction of various political parties. In 1950, the Indian Affairs Branch was transferred to the Citizen and Immigration, where it still exists today. In 1966, the legal title, Indian Affairs and Northern Development, was created. And although there has been many working titles, such as the Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development in 2011, and the Indigenous and Northern Affairs in 2015, the current legal and working title created by Prime Minister Trudeau on July 18, 2018 is the Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs and Crown Indigenous Relation. The legal institution that governs the Indigenous people of Canada has changed throughout the years through the direction of various political parties. In 1950, the Indian Affairs Branch was transferred to Citizenship and Immigration, where it still exists today. In 1966, the legal title Indian Affairs and Northern Development was created, and although there's been many working titles such as Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development in 2011 and Indigenous and Northern Affairs in 2015, the current legal and working title created by Prime Minister Trudeau on July 18, 2018 is the Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs. No matter the name, the federal government has not only failed the Indigenous population, it has for decades discriminated and denied the population basic human rights. Activist Yukata Dirk states Canada has adopted the historical document in 1948 which guarantees everyone the right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being. This includes food, clothing, housing, and necessary social services. Canada has failed to do this based on the standard of living adequate for the Indigenous population through cultural imperialism and status quo white settler privilege. Presently, child poverty is a growing issue for the Indigenous population. Despite promises from federal and provincial government to address the issue of child poverty and eliminate it by 2000, more than 50% of Indigenous children live in poverty. This includes children on and off reserves. Based on the data from the 2006 census, this study found that the average child poverty rate for children in Canada is 17%, while the Indigenous child rate is 3 times higher. Recently, it has been estimated the number has grown to 62% in Manitoba and 64% in Saskatchewan. These numbers are just simply devastating. In addition, Indigenous children are 3 times more likely to live in a house requiring major repairs and 5 times more likely to live in an overcrowded house. Financially, the provinces provide social service to all its citizens in the province, but Indigenous children. The federal government is responsible for funding, social services, health care, education, and income support for the Indigenous population. Transfer payments for social services on the reserve has increased by 2% per year since 1996, unadjusted for their economic needs and population growth. The removal of this cap on funding growth and an adjustment of transfer would reduce poverty. In Canada today, Indigenous youth represent 5% of the youth population, yet 50% of children and youth under government care are of Indigenous ancestry. Most government interventions involving Indigenous in out-of-home placement stem from charges of neglect rather than abuse. Structural and social factors such as poverty and inadequate housing from the effects of colonization are key factors for Indigenous families. Additionally, it is estimated that 3 times as many Indigenous children went under government care because of the residential school era, which saw them taken out of their homes and away from their parents by child welfare services. And did you know that the last residential school closed only in 1996? A crisis intervention approach to child welfare resulted from the provincial government's refusal to extend anything beyond child protection services on the reserves. Indigenous children were removed from their homes without warning and placed in foster care. It was through provincial child welfare legislation that social policy destabilized the Indigenous population, and it is estimated that currently there are 27,000 Indigenous children in care of child welfare agencies and are homeless. Did you know Indigenous communities receive 22% less funding per child, but are overrepresented at every level of child welfare exposure, from investigation to out-of-home placement? Additionally, did you know the Family Allowance was the first major benefit program extended to the Indigenous people, but it was also used to assimilate them? Machkovich and Flavel, who are authorities on child benefits in Canada, state that the Department of Indian Affairs did not trust Indigenous people to administer their own funds, putting tighter control on the money. A drop in relief expenditure after the introduction of family allowance suggests that it was being used to replace rather than supplement them. Medical research highlighting the harms that typically follow time spent in the child welfare system indicate the federal government and policymakers have failed to address these outcomes among Indigenous children they are supposed to protect. It is through the need to assimilate and tear down the culture and identity of the Indigenous that Indigenous children are overrepresented in the system. Did you know, in addition to the issue of overrepresentation and homelessness faced by Indigenous children, those on the reserves are faced with a water crisis? Burnside's report and a national assessment of First Nation water indicates 73% of water system and 65% of all wastewater systems are categorized to medium to high risk. Presently, there are no laws and regulations governing the provision of drinking water in the Indigenous communities, and sadly, the Indian Act does not authorize the protection of source water and provides no provision for them. In 1977, the Canadian government did promise to provide reserves with water and sanitation, which was comparable to white settler communities and the communities we live in, and a federal policy report proposed to expand infrastructure programs for reserves, but sadly, it was never done. In 1991, Indian and Northern Affairs Canada committed to achieving equality amongst Canadians with respect to safe water. However, it wasn't achieved. Bill S-11, the Safe Drinking Water Act for First Nations, was introduced in the Senate in 2010, but it died because of a federal election in 2011. And since then, it has not been reintroduced. Reserve leaders are left wondering how to get funding and how to fix the situation. Paul Meador research into death by poverty in the First Nation communities confirms that the federal government has become adept at deferring crisis issues by calling for additional studies or research into the problem. And might I add, Canada has also shown the tendency to avoid the collection of critical data that would support different policy choices. Additionally, Canada welcomes conventional refugees from countries where war, human rights violations, and poverty has made life unlivable. Yet the Indigenous population is fighting for basic human rights at many levels here. Prime Minister Trudeau stated that when he began his term as Prime Minister, constitutionally guaranteed rights of First Nations in Canada are not an inconvenience, but are rather a sacred obligation. He promised that he would be partners with the Indigenous population for years to come. It is now 2018, and though Prime Minister Trudeau did make an inquiry into the hundreds of missing Indigenous women, nothing has changed to improve the condition of the Indigenous population. Did you know that Canada has been on the world stage in a capacity which indicates a lack of interest or support for Indigenous rights? After 20 years of negotiation, the UN adopted the landmark Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007. The document spelled collective and individual rights of Indigenous people and covered everything from access to natural resources, to land and self-government, and the right to informed decisions that affect their lives. The Declaration drew on decades of international human rights laws and established that inherent rights of the Indigenous people are human rights. On September 13, 2007, Canada, with 3 other countries, refused to sign on to it. In addition, in 2014, Canada stood alone as the only member of the UN who rejected a landmark Indigenous rights document. Former President Stephen Harper simply refused to sign it, despite his public apology to Indigenous Canadians for the residential school system. Sadly, Indigenous peoples have very little input into the policy process and what is beneficial for them. When it comes to all these issues Indigenous children and people face, there's a lack of social justice and human rights. Canada is one of the most multicultural countries in the world, and to the home of immigrants from all around the world. Len Gale, who's an advocate, artist, writer, and an outspoken critic of colonial law and policies that harm Indigenous people, grew up distant from her Algonquin roots and has been denied her Indigenous status because of sex-based discrimination from the Indian Act and her being mixed blood. She has been considered only as French-Canadian. After decades of a long battle, Gale finally won her case in Ontario's highest court in April 2017 to the right to be Indigenous. Gale believes Canada and the Indigenous population can work together, but doesn't see any progress on the front. She shared that the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Minister, Carolyn Bennett, is still promoting a model of land claim and self-government process that is rooted in extinguishment. She explains nothing has changed. Minister Bennett's office replied by saying, "Our government is advancing a new relationship with Indigenous peoples based on the recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership." In addition, she said the Crown is meeting its constitutional obligations with respect to Aboriginal and treaty rights, adhering to international human rights standards, including the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. Lynn believes anyone can be an ally to the Indigenous and has a list of ways to be a responsible ally on her website. Lynn Gale's website is www.lynngehl.com. The spelling is Lynngehl. Did you know becoming an ally is much easier than most people think? Cindy Blackstock is the executive director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society and is a dedicated advocate for Indigenous children involved with the child care welfare system. In 2007, Cindy Blackstock brought the federal government to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal on a complaint that the government has systemically discriminated against Indigenous children and families by underfunding child welfare services for the population. In 2015, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruled in favor of Cindy Blackstock and found that the government had discriminated against the Indigenous people and ordered that they fix the underfunding. In February of 2008, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal issued a non-compliance order to the federal government for the fourth time for not following through. Since then, we have seen a little action being taken through budgets. Cindy Blackstock continues to advocate about the overrepresentation of Indigenous children and families involved in the child welfare agency. But these children still need your help. And here's what you can do. Read about the ruling and find out what it means. Write to the Prime Minister or a member of your Parliament to demand 1. Immediate implementation for funding to relieve Indigenous child suffering, and 2. Canada work with Indigenous to set things right and put an end to discrimination. Many people who have interactions with child welfare agencies are aware that the system has flaws. However, many are not aware of how much worse the children welfare system is for Indigenous children in Canada. One person who's on a mission to bring awareness to this situation is Nancy Rowe. Her They Can Go Home Moccasin project is bringing awareness to Indigenous children in the system. Nancy is from Mississauga New Credits First Nation and is seeking to collect 165,000 pairs of moccasins to represent each Indigenous child that is affected by the child welfare system. Loose Lip magazine, which was founded and is run by 2 journalist grads, Christine Alexander and Brittany Tiplady, is Vancouver's only feminist publication covering all things women and related to First Nation issues. They share 10 ways to be an ally to the Indigenous population. 1. Self-identify. If the lands you are living on are not those of your ancestor, you are a guest in someone else's homeland and should act respectively. This is the beginning of dismantling privilege and understanding your place in the colonial structure. 2. Don't support the erasure of history and research on your own about the Indigenous history. Did you know that the Indigenous groups were given blankets infected with smallpox? And did you know they were starved out for their territories? Number 3, purchase from Indigenous artists. Support Indigenous-backed businesses and local Indigenous creators. When we purchase goods, we support them with our dollar, and many things that we purchase have purpose and meaning. You can gift the Indigenous child in the welfare system. Additionally, you can become a foster parent to a child in the system and reconnect them to their history and take the opportunity to advocate for the Indigenous way of life. Want to start now? Here are some great Indigenous-owned businesses and artists to check out. www.second35.com, www.cheekbonebeauty.ca, and www.beyondbuckskin.com. Well, that's my podcast for today. I'm Yvonne Asmah. Next week I will discuss Indigenous youth and urban city homelessness. Many blessings flow to you and through you.